What's up, everybody? Michael here. I'm officially back from RC Houston. So it's time we did a breakdown of how the event went. So I'm going to go over the deck list that I submitted, why I registered the cards that I did. I'm going to go over the changes that I would make going forward. I got a spicy side event list to share with y'all, why I put it together. And I'm going to go through all of my matches. So if anything like interesting pops up, and we can treat this kind of like our state of the union Demir FrogTide, Esper FrogTide kind of video for the month, to let you know where I think everything is lining up, where I think we need to go from here, what was good, what was bad, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, if you enjoy this kind of content, feel free to leave a like on the video, maybe consider commenting, sharing it with a friend, or come join us over at the Control Freak Discord to talk about future videos, what we want to try out going forward. Anyway, let's go ahead and hop on into it and get talking about our list a little bit. So this is certainly going to be a lot more free form, don't have anything scripted, so hopefully I'll remember everything off the top of my head. If not, I might have to interject farther into the video, but we'll see how it goes. Anyway, the list you see on screen is the 75 that I registered for RC Houston this weekend. Ended up going 5-4, losing my last 2 rounds that were both winning ends to day 2. Unfortunate, but it happens. So let's talk about the list a little bit. First off, you'll notice something significant missing, and that's the white splash. There's no copies of Pest Control, very few Wrath effects in the 75. What gives? And the short answer is I just decided to give up the affinity matchup for the weekend. I decided that that was one that even if I devoted 3 or 4 copies of Pest Control, which I was about to register 4 copies in, 1 in the main, 3 in the side, and ultimately decided that that card doesn't guarantee the win. It's still an uphill battle, and I don't want to waste 4 slots, maybe 5 if I added a Stony Silence, to bring a 20% matchup up to 30-35% and not even be guaranteed to see it. And those were cards that I just did not aggressively want in other matchups. So I said, wipe my hands of it. I'm not going to deal with affinity. If they beat me, they beat me, but it is what it is. I'm just not going to spend all those resources to that matchup when I could be using them for extra copies of matchups that I can win post board. So that's why we don't have any of the white splash. Instead, we've got a pretty solid Demir Murktide core. We've got Tameo, Psychic Frog, Bowmaster, Murktide. Kaito is like our main threat package. A little bit of extra utility and subtlety. You'll notice there's 6 1-mana hand disruption spells. So I've got the full 4 Thoughtseize plus 2 copies of Dreams of Steel and Oil. The big reason for the inclusion of the Dreams and Steel and Oil is, 1, it's really, really good into the Goryo's decks, being able to exile an Atraxa, whether it's in hand or in the graveyard. They can't discard an Atraxa in response to a frog like you would with a Thoughtseize. So it's really good into Goryo's. I've expected a large amount of Solitude decks. So having the 4 Thoughtseize as well as 2 Dreams to help fight the Solitudes out of hand and potentially exile some number in like the Blink matchups. But I didn't want to replace any of the copies of Thoughtseize because I do think it's very significant to be able to hit things like Summoner's Pact from Amulet or Neobrand, or you can hit like Leyline Binding from Zoo. You can hit Ephemerates and things with Thoughtseize, Planeswalkers like Teferi that you wouldn't be able to hit with Dreams. And so I think the versatility of Thoughtseize kind of outweighs the exile effect of Dreams. I've got a 3-1 split of Preordain and Cling to Dust. I knew I wanted to play 4 cantrips. Kind of decided last minute that I was going to run 3 Preordain, 1 Cling to Dust, just to try to have an extra 2-for-1 in the deck, like an extra hit something in response to a Goryo's or before a an Overlord trigger resolves, and maybe draw another card later on. I will say that I got to draw multiple cards off Cling to Dust a couple times, so it did feel like it was a little more impactful than a preordain in some late game situations. I've got 3 copies of Tameo. I think that Tameo and Kaito are, outside of Frog, just the best threat package that Dimir has access to. So I wanted to make sure I had good counts on those. 4 Fatal Push, we all know. 2 Spell Snare, 4 Counterspell kind of stock. 2 Orcish Bowmasters. I just didn't feel like I was enabling Kaito enough with just the 4 Frog, 3 Tameo. There's also a lot of times that you're wanting to race with a Frog, and so picking it up with a Kaito is very awkward, doesn't really curve out well. It makes it so that those discarded cards aren't getting you a lot of value. So I wanted to make sure I had ways to ninjutsu Kaito that weren't picking up a Frog. 2 copies of Shieldred's Edict. I'm like back and forth between Shieldred's Edict and Strategic Betrayal. The reason that I ended up going with Shieldred's Edict instead of Betrayal is I wanted another main deck answer to Teferi Time Reveler. I kind of thought that card was going to be extremely relevant this weekend with Esper Blink, with Esper Goryo's, and I wanted to have a couple more answers to interact with it. It's also nice that it can hit like a Quantum Riddler in response to an Ephemerate, or Solitude in response to an Ephemerate, instead of having to let them resolve their Quantum Riddler, let them cast Ephemerate, resolve it, and then Strategic Betrayal on your turn after they've already drawn an extra card off that Ephemerate. 3 copies of Force Negation because free spells are great. 2 copies of Murktide Regent. I'll get a little more into Murktide Regent as I go over my matchups. But just a heads up, I will say it was not particularly impressive on the weekend. 1 copy of Subtlety. I've seen like the Dimir based Blink decks running 4 copies alongside their 4 Overlord of the Baelmerk. Really, I think Subtlety was an underperformer on the weekend. I think that the power level difference between Subtlety and Solitude is so significant, especially when all the decks are turning into Quantum Riddler piles. So if your opponent Solitudes you and your card is just gone, that's so much worse than you subtletying them. They put the card on top and then warp a Quantum Riddler and draw right back into it. And all of a sudden, like, you've just gone down 2 cards for no real benefit. And then finally, Kaito, Bane of Nightmares. I think outside of Tameo and Frog, Kaito was easily the best card in the deck on the weekend. Contributed to multiple match wins, which I'll break down in more detail momentarily. In the sideboard, we got 2 copies of Harbinger of the Seas because I think that you're absolutely doing yourself a disservice if you're not running Harbinger of the Seas. 3 Mystical Dispute, really for like the Quantum Riddler matchups. I think that countering the first iteration of Riddler being warped, especially on like turn 2 or 3 or 4, where they're trying to warp plus play an Ephemerate, is a really big deal. Plus, Mystical Dispute on the opposing side is an extremely popular sideboard card right now. We're seeing like Goryo's and the Blink decks and whatnot running 2 or 3 copies. Jeskai Blink showed up with 2 or 3 copies. So being able to use Dispute to fight over opposing disputes is a really common line that comes up. 2 Stern Scolding. These Stern Scoldings used to be predominantly for Boros. They've kind of turned into just like the counter for Solitude, being able to fight over them playing Solitude for free with a 1 mana answer to it has been very nice. 4 copies of Consigned to Memory. We all know Tron's out there. It's not going anywhere. 1 Strategic Betrayal, extra answer out of the board, extra Edict effect for that gets around Ephemerate. And the secondary effect of exiling the yard is extremely relevant against Goryo's Vengeance, against Flage decks like Boros and Zoo. as well as the Jeskai Blink deck that was showing up. A Surgical Extraction. I was looking for an extra piece of Grave Hate since I was like not running any Nihil Spellbomb. Surgical Extraction could come in against the Neo forms, the amulets to help interact there. It could come in against Blink if I just wanted an extra answer to Solitude in the yard. Had a decent amount of versatility and would allow you to tap out for things like Frog on 2 or Kaito on 3 without falling too far behind if your opponent did have like a discard go for Gorios. 1 Engineered Explosives because I wanted some sort of Wrath effect in the 75, but the only deck that I actively care about wrathing is Affinity, Boros to a smaller percent, but Affinity predominantly, and EE did the same job as Pest Control, where 0 mana, or 2 mana for Pest Control versus 0 to cast EE, 2 to crack was the same mana cost. It allowed you to sweep up the constructs and the drone tokens and all that. Obviously, you missed the 1-drops like Shadow Spear, Lava Spur Boots, Springleaf Drum, but hitting a good chunk of it's better than hitting nothing. And then finally, the Void Mirror. I wanted an extra hate piece for the Eldrazi-Tron matchup. I've been really liking 2 copies of Spreading Seas on the board, but I didn't have the sideboard space for it. So Void Mirror was a last-minute inclusion in the list. Just to have a little extra hate there. It was also a card that I could bring in against Affinity. I could bring it in against a few like Neoform style decks with Pact and Negation, Summoner's Pact, if I wanted to. I could bring it in against the Solitude decks, but I don't think that I did. But anyway, that's the 75 that I registered. That's my reasonings. Let's hit up some of these matchups. So, matchups, as shown on screen, ended up 5-4. Did not make day 2, but learned a lot of good stuff along the way. So let's go ahead and get into these. First round, played against Amulet Titan. Typically a really good matchup. A little bit of a variant situation. Game 1, I kept a hand that had like a couple Thoughtseize, a Counterspell, Preordain, few lands, and just never found anything with power and toughness. So my opponent was able to chain together like a Saga into a second Saga into a Echoing Deeps for a third Saga, and kind of run away with things that way. While I kind of sat back, removed a couple creatures, and died with like a bunch of counter spells in hand. Game 2, I know I was able to bait out a Dismember with a Tameo, and then follow up with a Harbinger to lock out the game, and then like a couple turns later played out a Murktide and closed things out. Game 3, I remember pretty vividly. I Thoughtseized early on, and they had a Dismember and a Lithomantic Barrage. A 1-red sorcery, deal 5 damage to target blue creature, can't be countered. My only threat in hand at the time was a Murktide Regent. So my thought was, okay, well, I've got Thoughtseize going to the yard. I've got a couple more spells I can cast, like a counter spell and something else, and I can get this Murktide big enough to survive the barrage. No problem. The game played a little back and forth the first couple turns, and then I think it was like turn 4. I've got enough spells in my yard to cast the Murktide Regent, so I'll get to do that next turn. And my opponent casts a Malevolent Rumble. And I'm looking at my hand like I have a Strategic Betrayal. So next turn, I can Strategic Betrayal, get rid of the token, exile the yard, and cast the Murktide after that for a point more. They don't have an Amulet out. They don't have a Saga out. So this Murktide will be able to get the ball rolling. And I remember they flipped over their cards, and it was just like Amulet of Vigor, Primeval Titan, Urza Saga. I was like, okay, well, those are all really good cards, but I think I can beat all of those with getting down a Murktide and racing. And then the last card off the top is Bojuka Bog. And they take the Bojuka Bog, bog me, pass the turn. So now I've got a Murktide stranded in hand. I'm able to refill the yard a little bit, get back to a state where I can cast a Murktide Regent and pass through. Opponent plays a bounce land, picks back up their Bajuka Bog. I'm like, okay, well, they can't play it back this turn, so I'll get to cast the Murktide on my turn. And they followed up with like an Arboreal Grazer or Spelunking, one of the two, that let them put the Bajuka Bog back into play, bog me again. And I was just never able to play out a threat. And a couple turns later, they started hard casting Titans. So that was kind of the tone of the weekend for Murktide Regent for me. Is it just was really awkward to cast, did not come down when I wanted it to, or was able to be dealt with pretty easily. Round 2, I was up against a really nice opponent on Esper Goryo's. I don't think there's too much to say about this matchup. I just remember that game 1, they did get off double Goryo's. They were able to Goryo's an Atraxa and Goryo's a Griselbrand. I had the Atraxa answered with a Strategic Betrayal or Shieldred's Edict. And then the Griselbrand came down. I had a Bowmasters on board. And so they couldn't draw 7, but they were able to just hit me in the face once. I got down a big Murktide, but they were able to find another Goryo's for another Atraxa. And I lost out on that one. Games 2 and 3, however, both went the same way, where I had a turn 1 or turn 2 Tamiyo with like hand disruption. I think I'm pretty sure game 2 I was on the play with a turn 1 Tamiyo, turn 2 double Preordain, flip the Tamiyo, and then just protect it. Ulted a few turns later. That won the game. Game 3 was the same kind of deal, like Thoughtseize away a Solitude, get down a turn 2 Tamiyo with a Subtlety or Stern Scolding backup, and then turn 3 attack, Preordain, crack a Clue, flip the Tamiyo. Tamiyo ticked up, ulted, and that was the end of that one. Round 3 against Is It Prowess. I do not remember much of this matchup at all, except for the fact that like I had the force negation for the Corey Steel Cutter every time. Game 2, I was able to Strategic Betrayal to take them off Delirium so they couldn't Unholy Heat my Frog. And yeah, I just had really, really good draws that round. Not a lot to say there. Round 4 was my second Goryo's opponent. I remember this matchup. Opponent was really nice, very fast-paced gamer. And I remember them having like double or triple Quantum Riddler all 3 games. Game 1 came down to them having double Riddler on board versus me having a Kaito. And I was able to win with a Kaito and a Frog. We got into a spot where I know that I was trying to play around Solitude. Like they had 2 unknown cards in hand. I had a Frog and a Kaito. I could swing for lethal if I discarded my entire hand and made a Kaito emblem. But if they had a Solitude and a white card, I just lost on the spot. So I was looking at my hand, trying to figure out if there was a way that I could win without discarding my hand. And it essentially was attack through, stun down one of the Quantum Riddlers, let them kill the Kaito on the way back. And as long as I keep anything else off the board, I could kill with Frog the next turn. So I attacked in with both, ended up drawing a counter spell off the Frog, stunned down the Murktide, passed. My opponent drew, and I think scooped it up there, and then went to show me their graveyard and exile, and all 4 Solitudes were either in the graveyard or exiled. So I was playing around something that didn't even matter because it couldn't happen. Games 2 and 3. I remember game 2, opponent won with just a bunch of Quantum Riddlers. Didn't go for Goryo's at any point. Then game 3, I won with Kaito. just getting down Kaito early and starting to tick up very, very aggressively until Kaito was able to put Quantum Riddlers on Abyss mode, which is always a fun part to be at, seeing like a 6-7 Kaito attacking through. Round 5 against Jeskai Control. So this was like Jeskai Blink, except their creatures were in the sideboard. They had the Solitudes, Flages, Riddlers, Ephemerates, a bunch, like 3 Teferis in the main deck, and then had Ragavan, Felia in the sideboard, like 2 copies of each. And that was really, really rough. Being pre-boarded kind of with a bunch of Teferis is very, very tough for our deck to deal with, while also trying to fight over Quantum Riddlers and Flages. I remember game 1 ended up losing to a bunch of Flages. Game 2, I was able to sneak down a Kaito and get through. Game 3 was back to here's a bunch of Flages, here's Teferi, and I think I had like a Stern Scolding that just wasn't lining up with like Quantum Riddler and Flage on their side. So just a case of my cards not really lining up effectively with the threats that they saw. Round 6 was another Prowess player. Game 1, I remember being really surprised because they threw a bunch of resources into killing a frog, like bolt, dart it, flashback dart, play another dart, target the frog or something like that. And I wanted to save the frog, but ultimately couldn't. And we got into a top deck war, and they just top decked like Expressive Iteration and stuff. And I was top decking not answers to Expressive Iteration. Game 2, typical, like I've got an answer for Corey still. I've got Bowmaster to kill your turn 1. Dragon's Rage Channeler kind of curve out nicely. And then game 3, there was an awkward point. I will tell the full story on the Discord. I'm not gonna get into it too much here, but it was effectively we had a couple moments where we were disagreeing on how the game had progressed or what had happened at certain points, and it didn't matter enough at that time. Like I had a good board, I had good cards in hand, so I probably gave into some positions I didn't really need to give into, and I ended up winning, thankfully. But it was just some awkward, not really communicating as well as we could have. But either way, it was, again, Prowess having a difficult time with answering like Murktide or stuff, me answering their Murktide. Round 7, up against another Jeskai Blink player. This was like the more traditional shell. The Ragavans, Felias in the main, all that good stuff. Game 1, I remember I won a pretty draw, or no, game 1 I lost to Warped Riddler on like turn 3. Just didn't have an answer for that. Games 2 and 3, my opponent flooded pretty badly. Game 3 especially. Game 2, I was able to get down an early Kaito and get some pressure going while I was able to draw really well. Game 3, I remember they had a streak of just like 5 or 6 turns in a row hitting lands where if at any point they hit a Flage, the game was over. But after like that 5 or 6 turn window, I finally was able to like get a frog down, get some card advantage going, eventually got a Kaito down after the frog, and found some answers to where it wouldn't have killed me after that. But for that brief moment there, I was 100% dead to a Flage. Round 8 was really, really fun. I looked at the match sheet when I got my pairing, and it said that I was up against Dimir midrange. I'm like, well, I'm on Dimir midrange. they're on Demir mid-range. Are we about to have a mirror match? And I get to the table, and my opponent's really nice. We're talking back and forth a little bit. And we get ready to exchange deck lists. And he goes, "This is going to look really familiar to you." I'm like, uh-oh, that's kind of terrifying. And he hands me a list. And it's a list that I had put together about a week ago. Let's see if I can pull it up here. Yeah, with pest controls on the board, Vanishing Verse, High Noon. And I really like this list. I think it's got some very, very strong cards. I think Vanishing Verse is really underrated. But it's got like the 4 Thoughtseize, the 2 Dreams in the main. We're almost on identical threat packages. I've got 1 Subtlety where he's got 2, really, really close to a mirror match. And it goes about how you would expect for the mirror, which is whoever gets Kaito down probably wins. So game 1, we have a stall out back and forth. Eventually, I'm able to sneak through a Bowmaster, untap Ninjutsu a Kaito, win. Game 2, I go for, I think, a Bowmaster on my opponent's instep. They counter it, go to my turn. They have their own Bowmaster. I go to counter. They counter my counter, untap, they Kaito. Game's over. And finally, game 3, we have a really, really drawn out draw-go game for a while. Gets to the point where my opponent discards to hand size. And we get to their instep and start a fight over, I think, a Bowmaster. And they end up winning the fight. And I can, they cast a Thoughtseize. And I've got like Murktide, Kaito, Frog, Counterspell, Mystical Dispute or something in hand. So like I'm trying to fight over this Thoughtseize to protect my Kaito. We fight over it. They end up winning the Counterspell war. They Thoughtseize, take my Kaito. My opponent asks after the match why I didn't cast it like 2 turns earlier. And I, like 2 turns earlier or something, a little bit earlier, he had been tapped out and I could have hard cast Kaito. And I said that it was my only threat in hand and I didn't want it to get forced. And turns out we had both, like, when I tell you this was a mirror match, I mean, we boarded almost identical out, like board out 2 Dreams of Steel and Oil, board out 3 Force of Negation. So I was playing around a card that I knew was right to board out, but I didn't know if my opponent had boarded it out, and they did. And I could have just like assumed my opponent was good at Magic, played the play that would have wrecked me if we were playing the mirror, or if I was playing the mirror against myself, and would have won the game more than likely based off that. So it was just really, really funny that I had that situation of like, well, you're right. Boarding out Force Negation is good. If I had thought that you had done that or really like put some thought into the board plan and what I did, I would have recognized that and played the Kaito. A really cool match. Really glad they were able to day 2 and bring some FrogTide love to the second round or second day Houston. Finally, round 9. So that round 8 was a winning into day 2. Round 9, of course, I get my my just rewards for not registering pest control. I get paired against Affinity on a winning in again. Game 1, actually, I got extremely lucky. They didn't have a fast start, or I think I might have thought seized away at Pinnacle Emissary. They mulled to 5. They had a slow start. I had a really interesting line with a 6/6 Murktide out. Opponent was attacking him with a 6/6 construct that had a Shadow Spear attached to it, making it a 7/7. And I was able to block with my Murktide, Cling to Dust, target something out of their graveyard that didn't matter, draw the card off Cling to Dust, and then escape Cling to Dust, exiling another instant in my graveyard to put 2 more counters on the Murktide, because Cling to Dust leaving the graveyard, going onto the stack, adds a counter to the Murktide. So I was able to add 2 counters to the Murktide there, make it an 8/8, eat the construct, and then eventually kill them in a few turns by just attacking back with like an 8/8 Murktide while they're trying to hit me with a 1/2 Ornithopter with a Shadow Spear. So get game 1. Game 2, I think I've got them stalled out, and then rip a couple Urza Sagas off the top. You know how that is. And game 3, or game 2, I thought I had them stalled and was getting ready to cast a Murktide, and they hit an Urza Saga and cast a Tormod's Crypt from hand and were able to take me off of Murktide. And game 3 went almost the exact same way, where I stalled out a couple turns early, or stopped my opponent from having an explosive turn, got ready to cast a Murktide, and as soon as I did, they top decked a Tormod's Crypt and exiled my graveyard before the Murktide could be cast. So games 2 and 3, the only threat I saw was Murktide, got crypted off of it both times. Just like round 1, game 3, the only threat I saw was Murktide and got Bajuka bogged off of it. So like I mentioned, Murktide as my big threat for the weekend did not do particularly well, was not very thrilled with it, and will probably not be registering it in the near future. So let's get back to the list and talk a little bit about what I would change and what I did change going into Sunday. Now, the fun part of the video: what performed well, what underperformed, what would I change going forward? Let's go from left to right, because I feel like that's what I do for most of the videos and it makes things simple. The mana base, I think, performed fine. I had no mana issues all weekend. I didn't have any problems with not having the right colors of land. There were very few times I needed more land. I don't even know if I really got flooded at all this weekend. So I was happy with the mana. I think that 21 mana sources for me feels right for making sure I'm able to get to like Murktide plus Counterspell or Ninjutsu Kaido on turn 3, along with like the 4 cantrips. Preordain really underperformed, and I need to elaborate on that a little bit. So Preordain underperformed not because Preordain was a bad cantrip, but it underperformed because I was casting Preordain while my opponent was warping Quantum Riddler. And when you try to compare the two side by side, one of them is drawing significantly more than 1 card in some occasions, is also pressuring your opponent's life total. And that's a pretty big deal when you're in these like drawn out mid-range mirror matches. They just get to up their threat count without really worrying too much about consistency, because at the end of the day, they're a force negation solitude deck and they're able to interact pretty freely regardless of what they're drawing. Spell Snare was really good. Getting to deal with like Frogs and Goryo's Vengeances and Thelia's a few times, Corey Steel Cutters, Expressive Iterations. I think every single matchup I saw had snare targets, including Amulet, like even Affinity with weapons manufacturing had some target, but of course you're still boarding out snare against Affinity. 3 Tameo felt really, really good. I think that Tameo contributed to the most wins. Tameo and Kaito were kind of like neck and neck for contributing to the most wins in the tournament for me. So really, really happy to play it. I think the card's an absolute menace to a lot of decks that don't have like a prismatic ending in their opener, especially if they have to evoke a Solitude early just to deal with a Tameo. You're kind of happy to get like a Solitude and something else out of hand. Cling to Dust. Kind of the same issue with Preordain. It's nice when you get to draw two, uh, but it is very mana intensive. And for that same 5 mana over 2 turns, you could just be casting a Quantum Riddler or warping a Quantum Riddler and casting it later. So I think Cling to Dust kind of falls in this cantrip trap of it's not drawing more than one card. We've kind of finally power crept one for one cantrips in Modern, I think. Fatal Push was fine. Dreams of Steel and Oil, I think, performed better than Thoughtseize on the weekend. Obviously, that had something to do with playing a bunch of Solitude decks and Flage decks instead of playing Zoo, instead of playing Tron. Didn't see any Tron in the main event. So if you're expecting a lot of those Blink style decks, I think Dreams of Steel and Oil is very, very underrated as a hand disruption spell. And I might even try some leagues of like 2 or 3 Dreams of Steel and Oil and no Thoughtseize just to see what happens. Counterspell was pretty good. I enjoyed having Counterspell in the deck, and I felt like it was necessary. I've tried some of the Quantum Riddler 0 Counterspell, like 4 Force, 4 Subtlety builds, and I don't think the counters line up that well as often as you want. So there's plenty of times that you've got Force Negation against an opposing Quantum Riddler, or you have to invoke a Subtlety when you could have just counterspelled and been like much happier, much higher on resources. Bowmaster really, really underperformed for me. It felt like the times that I did have Bowmaster in the dream scenario, it just didn't matter. So, for example, I had Bowmaster against my Prowess opponent's turn 1 Dragon's Rage Chandler, and they just untapped with like Swift Spear, dart your Bowmaster, attack, and now the Bowmaster is just like done. I know I got to kill the Dragon's Rage Chandler, but I spent 2 mana just to kill a 1 mana creature, and then the Bowmaster like doesn't do anything after that. I had a game against one of the Goryo's players that I got to Bowmaster in response to a Riddler that was warped to draw 2, and they drew their cards. I shot them in the face because I couldn't kill the Riddler. They didn't have anything else on board, and they just like prismatic ending the token a turn or 2 later, and it just didn't matter. I Bowmastered in response to a Thought Cast against Affinity, and all I could do was kill an Ornithopter and go 1 upstairs because there wasn't anything else on the board, and the Bowmaster just got outclassed by like a Urza Saga token, and there was nothing that I could do about that. So I was like, oh, I got to kill a 0/2 for 0 mana with my 2 mana, and then that was it. That's all I got to accomplish with the card. So really disappointed in Bowmaster. I still think that the only good use of it is setting up Kaito. I wish I could find a better 2-drop for that slot. Shieldred's Edict was pretty good. Definitely got to Edict away in Atraxa, got to Edict Quantum Riddlers. I don't think I got to Edict a Teferi, but I think only 1 resolved against me all weekend anyway. Edict was really, really good in the Prowess matchups. I got to sack away some big slick shot show-offs a few times. Psychic Frog, we all know Psychic Frog. Like, Psychic Frog is an S tier Magic card, wins you so many games. It's the reason to play the deck, and if you don't think that's the case, then register Gorios or register Blink, something else. Force Negation was great all weekend. Sync was good. Murktide, I've already explained, I thought was awful. Stuck in hand way too much, or when I did get it down, it was like just solitude fuel. Just hit the Murktide. You don't have enough time to set up this sculpted hand of like Murktide plus Counterspell plus Force and Subtlety when your opponent is playing a lot of things that interact with that stuff as well. Like you go for Murktide, they go for Mystical Dispute. Now you have to counterspell to deal with that. You resolve it, and they Solitude, and you Subtlety their Solitude, and then they just go Warp a Riddler, draw 2, Solitude again. Next turn, cast my Riddler, and like you're out of resources. I've drawn 4 cards. It's just not a good sequence of events for Murktide Regent. If there was more red-based interaction, I'd be all for it. Not a lot at the moment. Subtlety over or underperformed for the same reason, putting something back on top of their library when Quantum Riddler is like a 4 of in all the decks that you want to Subtlety feels like a horrendous exchange of resources. And then Kaito was phenomenal. Kaito was wrecking all of the Solitude players left and right. I did learn that if you're going to go in on Kaito against any of the Riddler decks, start making emblems very, very aggressively. Don't try to play the card advantage war. Start ticking up. So if your opponent hard casts a Riddler, you can keep attacking through it and hopefully force them into chump block mode like immediately. It was a lot more effective than trying to 0 and then they cast a Riddler and you realize your Kaito is like a 4/5 and you can't attack in, or you can, but nothing profitable is coming out of it. Out of the sideboard, Harbinger of the Seas was really, really good. Obviously, like locked out my Amulet opponent on round 1. I had sideboard or side event games where Harbinger locked people out. Mystical Dispute was good. Stern Scolding was not great, but it's the best answer for Solitude we have on, like, best answer we have for a Solitude on the stack with Subtlety underperforming. So I think it's a necessity to have a few extra answers there. If there was a good non-counterspell answer, so like not the actual card counterspell, but another spell that was good into Subtlety and Quantum, or good into Solitude and Quantum Riddler, I would like to hear that card. So if you know of anything, I'm all ears. For Consign was great. I'll talk a little bit more about my side event list in a second and share an idea I had there. One, Strategic Betrayal was really good. I got to Strategic Betrayal Agorio's opponent with Intraxa in the yard just to make them exile their yard. I got to do the same thing for a Prowess opponent. Surgical Extraction was not great. I surgical Urza's Saga's game 3 against my Titan opponent when I was planning on casting a Murktide to get it bigger than Lithomantic Barrage. And that's when I saw Malevolent Rumble that they proceeded to, or that was after they Malevolent Rumbled and flipped over the Saga that I was able to surgical. But otherwise, surgical didn't really do much for me. Didn't see any real combo matchups, just a lot of value mid-range piles that kind of bored out of their grave combos. Engineered Explosives did not see against Affinity. Affinity was basically, Affinity and Prowess were the only matchups I wanted it for, and I don't think I drew it in any of those matchups. And then Void Mirror, I didn't see it in the main event, but I did lock out a colorless Tron opponent with it in a side event game. So kind of cool there. I think the card's got potential, especially if you're thinking about cutting Harbinger. I really still like Harbinger. I think a lockout piece that can attack your opponent is a big deal. But if you're not as big of a Harbinger fan, then Void Mirror is probably a card you should really be looking at the moment. But the Tron players are also learning to play around it, so keep that in mind. Other than that, let's get into the side events. I did play in 2 side events, and I got a little more insight on some stuff I want to try out. So let's go over that. So a quick little interjection before I forget. I did want to include the future direction that I'm going to be going with the FrogTide list before I get into anything else, and why some of the cuts are being made, what I think I'm seeing that kind of justifies some of the decision points. So from the main deck, I'm probably going to be off Counterspell and Cling to Dust in the foreseeable future. The reason being, like I mentioned in the matches, it's just too low impact against other players playing like Quantum Riddler. So I'll probably start with something like cutting the Subtleties, the Murktides, and say a Preordain for 4 copies of Quantum Riddler. As much as I think the card messes up some of your combo oriented matchups, I think the card draw and the grind potential against the fair decks or the combo decks like Goryo's that are trying to go fair post board is too significant. So I think you want access to the Riddlers if you can. I know that the price is a pain and nobody wants to pay that much for Quantum Riddlers, but at the end of the day, my content is not necessarily about whether or not a card is budget or affordable. It's about putting together the best FrogTide shell possible, or in this case, Frog Riddler shell possible. The second adjustment I would like to make is cutting the rest of these preordains, cutting the Cling, cutting the at least 2 of these cantrips. Probably, unfortunately, needs to be the Dreams of Steel and Oil, but we'll test around with that a little bit. And cutting the Orcish Bowmasters to start looking for some suitable replacements to these cards. The first things that kind of come to mind are, could go to the 4 main deck Consigned to Memories, try to be a little more scam oriented. I don't necessarily love that plan, but something needs to change in the current list, because although I won the 2 Goryo's matchups and one of my 2 Jeskai matchups, it was not a situation where it could have had the same result if my opponents had drawn as well as they could have. Needed to get really, really lucky, and I don't like relying on that luck as a long-term mechanism for fighting those matchups. So we'll be making some sort of an adjustment there. And the threat package, need to keep the threat package up. So even with the 4 Riddler, 4 Frog, 3 Tameo, I think that there's room for another creature of some sort. It could be Snapcaster Mage, because without the Murktide Regents, the dependency on the graveyard's a little bit less. But without any of the 1-mana cantrips, even Snapcaster can have a little bit of an awkward moment. We've tried out Dolthy Voidwalker before. I don't think it's the best option out there, especially with Blink kind of on the decline. But it is really good into Blink, and it's good into some obscure combo matches. So I will be trying to figure out another threat to run alongside the Frog Tameo core, because I really, really want to keep access to Kaito. I think that Kaito is one of, if not the best card that we have access to into the Solitude Riddler matchups. Just being able to dodge so much removal, being able to clock really, really well. I don't want to lose access to that resource in the slightest. So I need to find another 2-drop or 1-drop to improve the consistency. Maybe going up to 4 Tameo is the right move, but figure out something to help out with that aspect. Other than that, sideboard wise, it's really, really open game. I think if the combo matchups that, like I mentioned, are getting worse, if you include Riddler, are that prevalent, then I will be looking at some more extreme ways to combat those matchups. So for example, like adding an extra Void Mirror, maybe not running Harbinger of the Seas, even though I love the card and think we should be playing it. If we adjust and swap to a Riddler heavy build, we need the ability to slow down Tron significantly. And I think Void Mirror does a better job of slowing them down than Harbinger, because even if they're one, they can't dismember the Void Mirror. And 2, if you're able to hold your consigns for exactly Ugin cast trigger and Devourer cast trigger, then you can keep your Void Mirror around while pressuring with like whatever threat you want to get to, because you got a lot more time to find one. Other than that, that's about it. Other than that, the sideboard options, like I said, you can kind of run what you want to run. Vexing Bauble is a card I would highly consider at the moment if those control or those combo matchups are popular. But I'm just going to kind of keep an eye on the meta, see where it shifts from here. So let's go into what we're going to be trying out next on stream. So the first side event, I played almost the same 75 that I ended up registering the main event. I wanted to try it out before actually getting to the main so I could see if it had any merit. That was Friday afternoon. Went 2-0 into prowess, 2-0 into another prowess, into draw with a guy that I knew from the Jackson area. So very, very underwhelming first 3-round side event. But the second 3-round side event, I decided to go off the rails a little bit and play Esper cards that I felt like casting. And that's what we've got here. And the reason I bring this up is because there were some ideas that I had that I wanted to bounce off of the community and see what you guys thought. So the first thing was I wanted to play a minimal counterspell for Quantum Riddler list. Again, like playing against Quantum Riddler all weekend while I'm casting Preordains felt very, very underwhelming. So I decided I'm going to load up on forces and subtleties. I know we've seen that formula before, and there's a few little differences here and there that I'll get into, but I wanted to be 4 Quantum Riddler, 3 force, 3 subtlety. Did fit a couple counterspell in here. We've got the 4 Tamiyo, 3 cantrips with Preordain, but I went with 2 Cling to Dust, 1 Preordain split, so that my cantrip would have a little more ability to be impactful to the game, and then possibly cantrip again later, but more just be a piece of interaction as opposed to trying to be a cantrip. The Preordain in the main is mainly because I was considering 3 Cling to Dust and ultimately decided just to run 2. So I had an extra slot open, just jammed a cantrip in there. The 2 Consigned Memories in the main were a multifaceted utility piece. So I don't like using Consign as just a 1-mana counter in the main of the FrogTide decks. It has targets against most decks, but a lot of times it's not that impactful. For example, you can consign the ETB trigger on an Atraxa that's been Goryo's, but if you can't deal with the Atraxa itself, then it just doesn't matter. Same thing with like Solitude. Like you can exile this or counter the Solitude's ETB ability, but if you can't deal with the actual Solitude, then it's a good chance they'll be able to outrace you or find Ephemerate and blink it and just get the exile effect again. So the consigns are mostly here as the scam Riddler option, with the chance of having a little bit of utility against the opposing matchup, depending on what it is. And with Teferi Time Reveler and 2 copies of Strategic Betrayal, plus the 2 Kaitos, I've got a few more ways of interacting with like a creature bigger than 4 CMC if it comes down early with an ETB ability. We've got the full 4 copies of Tamiyo because I wanted to max those out with the Quantum Riddlers to try to find more hands where I could get Tamiyo down on like turn 1 or 2, disrupt, interact, warp Riddler turn 3 or 4, get Tamiyo flipped, and try to tick up from there. We got the 2 Thoughtseize, 1 Dreams of Steel and Oil split instead of the 6 hand disruption spells. Did throw the 3rd Thoughtseize in the side, but basically the idea here was I wanted to play 3 hand disruption in the main, the 4th one in the sideboard. Dreams really overperformed in the main event, so I figured I would replace the 3rd Thoughtseize with it in the main here to give it a little more of a shot. 2 counterspell just for the late game. Try to hit 1, close out the game with whatever your threat of choice is. 1 Teferi, 3 Force Negation. Teferi mostly because the list wanted to be a value pile, and it really wanted to maximize the number of 2-for-1s I had. So Teferi being able to come down, bounce something back to hand, draw a card kind of fits right in line with that mentality. Also helps stall out a good bit into Quantum Riddler. 3 Subtlety. I know I said that I think Subtlety underperformed a lot, and I still mean that, but I feel like the fair Quantum Riddler shells need that free pitch stuff just to try to slow the game down. So a lot of times if you're seeing Subtlety in a shell like this, I kind of incentivize just like using it on any creature you see in the first couple turns to buy yourself a turn to get closer to Riddler drawing to, or closer to like hard casting a Riddler and letting the card advantage win you the game. And then finally the 2 Kaito, because 4 Tamio, 4 Frog, hopefully I can get into play a good bit. Most of my matchups I was getting Kaito down were like Flash in, Subtlety, untap, Ninjutsu Kaito off Subtlety, and hold up interaction or hold up Subtlety again. So it wasn't necessarily Bowmaster closing the game out or getting Kaito on board, but Subtlety. The sideboard, I ran full 4 copies of Pest Control, because if I run into Affinity in the side event, I'm going to at least give myself a fighting chance, even if I think it's not that much of a fighting chance. And the cool tech I wanted to try out was Notion Thief. So my idea here was I didn't think Bowmasters was punishing enough for Riddler. And it seemed that no matter what I did, my opponents were likely to have Riddler. So what was the best way I could punish them for it? And I thought about Narset Parter of Veils. Very, very hard. The problem I had with Narset was with 4 Tamio, 4 Frog, 3 Subtlety, 4 Quantum Riddler. There were a good number of whiffs with the 19 lands. So I didn't want to run a card that was going to have the potential to whiff if that were the case. So I thought, what's the next best option? And the next best option to me was they warp a Quantum Riddler, and instead of them drawing a card, I get their cards. So I'm just going to start taking all of your cards that Quantum Riddler would draw. And it's actually an idea that I want to explore a little bit more. I think you have to kind of give up the early warped Riddler, not interact with that as much, but take the opportunity to create a blowout scenario where your opponent is hard casting a Riddler late game, 1 card in hand, no cards in hand, whatever, and you're able to Notion Thief in response, draw 2 cards off of that, and then stop them from gaining card advantage with their Riddler going forward. I fully intend to try it out some more on stream and see if it's got any merit whatsoever. I don't know if it does, but I thought it looked really fun, and I didn't get to do it because I played against Grixis Reanimator the first round of the Sunday side event, beat that pretty handedly, ran into Amulet, or not Amulet, Prowess round 2, which was one of the matchups that I think Quantum Riddler makes significantly worse for us by being a 2 mana, put this aside, not actually interact, instead of a 2 mana 6/6, 7/7, 8/8 body on the battlefield. And then the last round was against Eldrazi Tron, where the main deck Consigned to Memory actually countered a Devourer of Destiny, and the cast trigger let me kill with a frog. And then game 3, I got to win, or game 2, my opponent had Natural Tron. So just Tower Mine, Power Plant from hand. They cast some 4 mana spell that I interacted with. The next turn, they played a Ugin's Labyrinth, exiled an Ugin, passed the turn. I was able to, I think, flip a Tameo and get down a Void Mirror. So I was like, okay, well, I can't stop the Ugin cast trigger, but I can stop the Ugin itself. And so hopefully that will get me somewhere. And on my instep, my opponent returned the Ugin to hand, untapped, played a Swamp from hand, hard cast Ugin, exiled the Tameo. And yeah, so if Eldrazi Tron sees natural Tron plus the one of basic to cast through Void Mirror, they're going to win those. But game 3, I was able to force negation to Mind Stone, Thought Seize a Thought Not Seer out of my opponent's hand, leave them with the Devourer and an Ugin, get a Void Mirror down when they had like 3 mana available, and they never cast anything after that. I think they drew into like Mind Stones and Talismans and Kozilek's Command and things that would have gotten them to Ugin or Devourer mana, but they couldn't cast any of those without them being countered, and we were able to seal the game with, I believe, a frog that game. But anyway, really fun list to play in the side events. I think that the card advantage was real. The problem is you really, really, really notice the difference in power between Solitude and Subtlety, and it cannot be understated. So probably in this upcoming week, I'm going to be trying out some more Esper Gorios. I know, big shout out to Noe, who top decked or top aided the modern RC. So if you see them in chat, whether on the Discord or in the Twitch chat, feel free to say congratulations as well. Big props to them. Been doing an absolutely fantastic job of knocking out tournament after tournament online, and really cool to see that same kind of result translate to paper. So they'll be knocking it out of the park at the next Pro Tour as well. Though I think that one is standard, but I can't remember. Either way, we'll be picking their brain for some advice on how to cast some Quantum Riddlers and Goryo's Vengeances. Other than that, I hope you all enjoyed the video and the wrap up here. Hopefully it gave you some ideas on how to attack the current meta. Hearing what worked or didn't work for me, what might be working or not working for you might be a little different. And if it is, please come share it in the Discord or let us know in the comments down below. Other than that, hope y'all have a fantastic rest of your day. Stay safe. Enjoy some good food and company. I will catch y'all back live later. Adios for now.